largely focuses on social and ecological dynamics, particularly how those may change or alter with conservation development practices, things like this. Sarah got an undergraduate degree in engineering, and then UT Austin, and then moved on to natural and environmental sciences at University of Illinois Chicago, or University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, right? Urbana-Champaign. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah. So thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Paul. Yeah, really excited to be here and talking with you today about my kind of new line of research, which is related to nature-based carbon markets. Let's see. So just to kind of give an overview of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to give an introduction to natural climate solutions, talk about the current credibility crisis in natural climate solution and voluntary carbon markets, and introduce the Science for High Integrity Frameworks to Transform Carbon Markets initiative, quite the mouthful, or SHIFT-CM, which is a large initiative between Yale and the Nature Conservancy, working to use science to overcome some of the challenges currently within the carbon market. And I'll focus in on work that I'm leading related to digital monitoring, reporting, and verification. And then back out and think kind of beyond mitigation, the role of natural climate solutions in the global goal on adaptation and the other co-benefits within NCS. So to give a little bit of background on me, I am a new assistant professor in the Forest and Wildlife Ecology department, as Paul mentioned. I do a lot of research on forests and agroforestry systems, thinking about ways that we can use policies to help support the adoption and expansion of these sustainable land management practices. And a lot of these types of practices fall under this umbrella of natural climate solutions, which are defined as a deliberate set of actions aiming to support, protect, restore, and improve the management of our forests, wetlands, agricultural systems, grasslands, and oceans to reduce carbon and while also delivering some social benefits, with no net negative, essentially, on food and fiber supply, doing no net harm socially or culturally. So natural climate solutions are increasingly getting plugged into carbon markets. So carbon markets are a mechanism to reduce global emissions by assigning an economic value to keep carbon out of the atmosphere, as I'm sure many of us already are quite aware of. So polluters can buy credits from projects that remove or avoid emissions, like forest conservation and restoration, and in doing so, they're removing CO2 from the air by protecting forests, restoring them, hence natural climate solutions. So this 2017 paper by Griscom et al. Highlighted the potential roles for natural climate solutions in terms of reducing our overall carbon emissions and keeping us on a, at the time, less than 2 degrees Celsius pathway. And so what you're seeing here is this business as usual emissions trajectory will require a really large amount of fossil fuel emission mitigation. But according to their analysis, natural climate solutions can offer about 20% of that chunk. And so the question is, how can we do that in a way that is verifiable, that is delivering the long-term climate benefits, and is not just kind of greenwashing and avoiding having to do this hard work of fossil fuel mitigation. And in order for carbon markets to work, we need to have proof our ecosystems really being protected or restored to store the additional carbon that they're promising. Because if you're using natural climate solutions as a way to offset carbon emissions in other sectors, we need to have some guarantee that the emissions are actually being removed in the natural climate solution setting. So the idea here is that you'll identify a project area and do some activities within that project area to store additional carbon. So this could be protecting the forest into the long term, implementing some improved management practices like lengthening rotation cycles or intentional thinning to prioritize specific species and manage understory. And the idea is you want to track what happens to that project area against what's happening in what we call baseline, a non-project area that is in every way similar to the project except for the existence of the project, and track how carbon is stored within each of those project areas over time. So assuming that we're successful in protecting these forests and managing them more effectively, we're still able to produce timber, fiber, while also ultimately storing more carbon than in the reference area that might be subject to the same human and ecological pressures degrading that forest. And so taking this difference is how we're generating a carbon credit. How do we actually identify appropriate baselines, figure out how much carbon is stored in those forests, and ensure that the credits generated are actually effective. And the short story is we're not doing that very well. There's a massive credibility crisis in voluntary carbon markets right now, specifically nature-based markets, where a huge amount of research has shown that many of the nature-based projects have overclaimed credits or failed to deliver the promised results. So many of you are probably familiar with the Guardian article from 2019 that suggested more than 90% of rainforest carbon offsets were essentially worthless. They were not delivering the benefits that they were intended to deliver. And the way that they did this was they looked at the project area and again identified a reference area and looked at the trajectories using synthetic control and matching approaches to look at how much additional carbon was actually being stored in the project area, and found that in many cases those projects were not doing what they promised to do. Either the forest wasn't under threat to begin with, or there was leakage where a lot of the benefits were actually just spilling over to neighboring areas, or reversals where maybe they managed the forest for a little while and then reverted back to the more negative practices. So how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this credibility crisis? The massive lack of confidence in the nature-based credits that are being generated, and ultimately has created a market that these projects are priced very, very low. So that's where ShiftCM comes in, the science for high integrity frameworks to transform carbon markets. So this work began when I was a postdoc at Yale, working on thinking through how we can essentially monitor projects better. How can we ensure that we're capturing the full system dynamics, appropriately crediting projects, appropriately designing projects, and monitoring them over time. And this work is really grounded in this framework for high integrity natural climate solutions, where the projects have to be nature-based, sustainable, additional, measurable, and equitable. So the kind of key evaluation criteria that we're thinking about within ShiftCM is, are these projects additional? So are they storing more carbon than would have been stored had the project not existed? Are they permanent, or how can we think about permanence in a way that generates new crediting mechanisms over time to ensure that whatever carbon is offset is actually kept out of the atmosphere for the long term? How are we reducing or accounting for leakage? How can we do this creation of baselines better? So I'm going to talk a little bit more about baselines and how remote sensing technologies can help us identify and monitor baselines effectively through improved measurement, reporting, and verification. And then thinking through safeguards. So how are the communities that are involved with these projects actually being protected? And their voices are being included within the process of these carbon markets. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, I'm going to focus in on this working group. So these are all working groups under Shift CM, thinking about ways to optimize climate solutions with durability considerations, selecting appropriate baselines, compensating reversal risks, quantifying market leakages, mapping durability, and digital monitoring, reporting, and verification, good practice guidance. So these working groups kind of came out of some workshops that we held in 2025, thinking about what could actually shift the needle within carbon markets. How could science help support the development of a better carbon market? And we convened a bunch of different actors from industry and academia to think through what are some of the major challenges within carbon markets that science can help overcome. And these were the themes that came out on top. So why think about digital approaches to monitoring, reporting, and verification? So digital MRV is essentially thinking about ways to incorporate remote sensing into tracking carbon stocks in forests, often using satellite-based observation in order to help kind of overcome earlier challenges with field-based MRV, where you're essentially sending researchers and or scientists and practitioners out in the field to measure tree height and diameter at breast height and estimate the amount of carbon stored within these projects at baseline and then periodically throughout the project's lifespan. This is really costly. It can be dangerous to send a bunch of people out to the field. It can be difficult to access the projects and requires a lot of burden on local communities to go out and collect this data. And historically, those measurements have been kind of haphazardly collected with a bunch of different metrics, reported in different ways, and requires a focus on auditing individual products. The idea is to shift that to more remote sensing-based approaches that allow for more reproducible and algorithmic calculation, interactive data visualization, and a shift to auditing the DMRV systems itself. And of course, these can't be entirely disentangled. In order to create a good digital MRV system, we need a bunch of field-based measurements in order to train and validate those models and ensure that they're accurately representing forest carbon within project areas. And I'm going to talk about a bunch of those.
When you say dangerous, do you mean because of local people or just because of the physical dangers of being in the wilderness?
Yeah, more the latter. So it's time-consuming, labor-intensive. You're going kind of off the beaten road, and it can be really challenging to access. You might be encountering all sorts of wildlife or hazards as you're going out and measuring those trees. Thanks. So the opportunities of DMRV for the nature-based carbon market. So as I mentioned, DMRV is the automated and integrated use of digital technologies. So I'm going to primarily focus on remote sensing, but it's also AI and machine learning, cloud computing and storing to monitor, report, and verify carbon projects in activities in near real time. And this recent article by Charlotte Wheeler really highlights a lot of the potential benefits of integrating remote sensing into the carbon market to track forest carbon through time, measure projects' additionality against robust dynamic baselines, which I'll talk about in a later slide, evaluate the extent of leakage, monitor permanence, and monitor reversals in much higher temporal and spatial resolution. So remote sensing offers a number of powerful benefits, offering wall-to-wall forest mapping. So instead of going out and measuring specific field plots, you're able to potentially map forest carbon globally in a consistent way and across time. It offers that consistent, scalable, and standardized measurement approach with digital and integrated data that you can layer in a bunch of different GIS and modeling tools. Can potentially be more cost effective, especially for very large or remote areas, and can potentially also increase the accessibility of carbon monitoring tools using Google Earth Engine apps or other globally accessible models for accessing forest carbon data. So digital MRV is increasingly being incorporated into the market, but it's been done so in a really inconsistent and essentially black box way. So there's a number of different companies that are creating global above ground biomass products like Sea Trees and Planet Labs that are intended to be ready to use for monitoring carbon projects. But as I'm going to talk about, there's a lot of reasons why these tools have some limitations. The idea for carbon crediting is essentially to, using DMRV is essentially to estimate the net biomass carbon estimate within the project area against the baseline area at each point over time, while providing discounts for leakage, reversals, and uncertainty in those carbon estimates that I'm going to talk about. All right, I'm going to pause for a moment. So why have we not yet expanded digital monitoring approaches into the carbon market? And this is the kind of the first gap that ShiftCM's DMRV working group is trying to fill, is identifying some key challenges and opportunities for overcoming those challenges, essentially setting a standard playing field for what DMRV is, can do, and what to look out for when evaluating DMRV products. So we're laying out these three areas of challenges, the first of which is technical and data uncertainty. So there's a critical challenge with model generalization and bias. So a lot of the data that are used to train DMRV carbon models are collected in the global north, predominantly in temperate forest systems, with a relative scarcity of data in tropical biomes, which makes them really difficult to verify for use for all carbon projects globally. These models are locally trained, but generalizing them globally can increase bias. So we're coming up with principles for validating against appropriate independent reference data and how to do that and think through that process. There's also issues with proprietary data and transparency barriers. So these proprietary models and black box models often make it impossible to assess model validity and uncertainty. So these companies will provide a report basically saying here's how we've assessed accuracy of these products globally, but there's a lack of transparency into how those models are actually developed and trained and validated over space and time. So we need more open model documentation, shared validation data sets, and transparent data infrastructure. And importantly, we need new methods for quantifying uncertainty and addressing those uncertainties within these products. So remote sensing, like most things, provides an estimate and not a direct measurement. which requires new forms of accuracy metrics and transparency as to how pixel level uncertainty is reported and aggregated and addressed within the policy of carbon markets. So I'm going to kind of pivot to a recent paper that I published, which was looking at global forest data sets. And I wanted to use this as a way to highlight kind of the critical differences in forest products and what that means for the appropriate use of DMRP. So within this paper, I took 8 different global land cover and forest cover products and looked at how they classified forest area across those products, and found a shockingly large disagreement in what areas are classified as forests, particularly in drier biomes. And if we can't even agree on where the world's forests are, that has really major implications for how we are crediting carbon markets. Within this, the global congruence for tropical and subtropical dry broadleaf forests was incredibly low, even with kind of removing a lot of the data sets that would not have performed well based on their forest definition, whereas tropical and subtropical moist broadleaf forests performed relatively well. But the kind of interesting thing from my perspective with this paper was we then looked at what the implications of those forest data set differences were for conservation, climate, and development policy, and found, depending on which data set you use, that could lead to like an order of magnitude difference in your estimates. So looking at the number of people who are living proximate to forests, there's a wide variation in terms of where those people are, but also the number of people who are depending on forests globally. When looking at carbon biomass as stored in forests, huge variation in this example in Kenya, which has many more dry forest biomes. The second challenge is related to institutions and governance. So many market actors typically don't have training in remote sensing technologies. They lack the tools or capacity to integrate satellite data into their planning. And there's this disconnect between data producers and end users that needs to be overcome in order to expand DMRB into practice. And even if we get all the technology right, decision making is political. Data doesn't drive decisions, people do. So we need to be working across the different stakeholder groups to understand what their concerns are related to carbon markets, what their concerns are with using digital data in carbon projects, and how we can ensure alignment in our priorities across those different stakeholder groups. And that can help to build new trust in the carbon market, new trust in new technologies. DMRB data, no matter how advanced, even if we can get the technology right, will still fail to instill necessary market confidence if we can't show that transparency and tools to make these technologies easily understood. The third and final challenge that we dove into was around equity, access, and data sovereignty, where, as I mentioned previously, a lot of these data and models have highly restricted access. Communities and nations need control over how their land data is used. Decisions based solely on satellite data can risk oversimplifying complex social ecological systems. It can't just be that we make a full conversion to using remote sensing within the carbon market. We still need to be having conversations with local stakeholders, local communities, and ensure that their voices and rights are being heard and respected. Without this level of co-production and stakeholder buy-in to these new tools, the data may lack legitimacy. And ultimately, we need some significant investment in technical training for local stakeholders to ensure more equitable adoption of these new tools. So ultimately, this deep dive into understanding what some of the challenges are with implementing digital monitoring, reporting, and verification within the carbon market has led us to discuss as a group, and you'll see this is a super diverse, super large team of people working as part of ShiftCM, both from registries, project developers, as well as folks from academia and different community groups, like the Kanike from the Indigenous People of Africa's Coordinating Committee, and other individuals who have more local on-the-ground knowledge. And so ultimately what we did was come up with this framework for evaluating DMRV for natural climate solution markets. And this is very much in progress work. I'm excited to get some feedback and insight from you all on how we're going about making these recommendations. But first and foremost, we're advocating for a more open science approach, increasing model transparency and data accessibility, working through validation with independent ground truth data, so making sure that we are accounting for kind of spatial differences over time, and thinking about a more strategic sampling approach for the training and validation data that's local to the project relevant. Creating new protocols for uncertainty quantification, handling, and reporting. And tied to this, we're working on creating open benchmarking data sets, new governance and oversight mechanisms, and within all of this, really focusing on a human rights-based approach to digital MRV. So some of our colleagues as part of this, who are part of this DMRV working group, went out and did some stakeholder mapping exercises to try and understand how different folks within the carbon market were viewing remote sensing for forest carbon crediting, and really found that across the board, we kind of were getting this right. These were the demands that the stakeholders were needing. So to kind of dive into some next steps and the sub-working groups under the DMRV umbrella, we're thinking about validation and uncertainty assessments, and making recommendations for what are the sources of uncertainty in digital MRV data to make that transparent to market stakeholders, and think through how we can essentially create a total uncertainty estimate with appropriate credit deductions according to that uncertainty. So the kind of primary sources of DMRV uncertainty include field or structural sources. So this could include measurement error, either from human measurement for the ground truth data or GPS measurement in terms of where the ground truth data is collected, allometric model error, and sampling design error. So making sure that we're doing a stratified random sample when we're validating our DMRV models, accounting for spatial temporal uncertainty, which is error arising from spatial or temporal mismatch between the ground plots and the area represented by a satellite pixel. Remote sensing uncertainty, which is errors introduced during the processing of remotely sensed data, of the raw data, which could include sensor noise, cloud cover, shadows, resolution noise, or canopy issues with canopy cover penetration, and then algorithmic errors associated with the machine learning model predictions themselves. And so with this, we want to make sure that we're able to create essentially a confidence interval around our carbon estimates, and take the lower end of that carbon estimate confidence interval when crediting, and also explore globally, different kind of minimum detectable changes across different project types. So what can we actually see using remote sensing data in terms of REDD+ projects, which are reducing deforestation or degradation, reforestation projects, agroforestry projects, improved forest management projects, and at what scales are we able to see changes. And to support this work, we have a separate DMRV benchmarking data working group that is working on creating first standards for a global benchmarking data set with validated forest measurements to improve model testing and calibration, thinking through what types of metadata requirements, what types of data are appropriate, and how to handle different types of forest field-based data collection and terrestrial laser scanner data that can be used to validate DMRV products. And ultimately, we're aiming to create a publicly available, user-friendly benchmarking resource to help developers and registries assess the quality of new and existing products. And then the third DMRV working group is thinking through dynamic baselines. So dynamic baselines are essentially approaches where you're looking across space and across time to look at how project and reference areas are changing, kind of in that first, one of those first figures I was showing. And specifically, we're looking at ways to incorporate digital data into the dynamic baselines pipeline. So this figure kind of compares field plot-based approaches with digital remote sensing-based approaches, where you're essentially looking at the project area, looking at a bunch of different pixels within the project area, and creating synthetic controls matching the project area with surrounding pixels, and then looking at how forest carbon changes within those pixels over time, and creating these error bars associated with both the project and the baseline, and how the baseline might look different over time based on the social conditions and drivers of forest carbon change over that area. And then finally, we're thinking about how we can create a human rights-based approach to DMRV. And essentially what we're doing is trying to gather a bunch of different stakeholders and actors and think through what their concerns are with DMRV, talk through this in a formalized way, and ensure that our recommendations for DMRV are avoiding overpromising, striving for greater transparency, conducting due diligence on risks to communities, and working to legitimize and embrace the need for a long-term cultural shift in how technology products are discussed, designed, and deployed. So we have been creating essentially a matrix to kind of check ourselves in terms of how we're doing in terms of transparency, accessibility, and how we can do that at different stages of the DMRV design process. While also recognizing that the VCM stakeholders have their own operational and commercial realities and priorities, and that there are new risks involved with developing new tools and technologies. There may be mistakes along the way. We can be transparent in terms of how we're discussing those and testing those, and ensuring that we're doing it in a way that builds trust instead of undermines trust in the carbon market. And kind of to push a little bit further, there's really a growing demand for data sovereignty. So this is something that we've been talking a lot about within our working group, where we want to think about ways for indigenous people, local communities to have more control over how their forests are mapped, monitored, and governed. Think about who owns the data and technology, the carbon, and how these different tools are being communicated and used in a way that's fair with free, prior, informed consent for communities. So I'm going to conclude with kind of some points for the future of digital monitoring, reporting, and verification. There's increased opportunities for high-frequency disturbance modeling, leveraging opticals and synthetic aperture radar sensors to detect near real-time disturbances, faster than current sensors. There's a big push for using more advanced AI approaches like deep learning and foundation models to improve land cover classification and biomass models. The opportunity for incorporating multi-scale measurement more effectively, integrating drone and terrestrial scanners with satellite data to create a multi-scale monitoring system for local ground truthing. New innovations in causal inference and attribution, bringing in new econometric approaches with remotely sensed data to demonstrate the causal carbon impacts of projects. And then there's also a push for more jurisdictional level projects where DMRD can help align project level accounting with jurisdictional and national accounting to help mitigate large scale leakage within national jurisdictions. And I just wanted to end with kind of the call out that even though there's all these kind of challenges with nature-based carbon markets, there's already a lot of infrastructure associated with the carbon market. I don't see it going away. There's so much policy investment and actors associated with the carbon market. So we really need to be thinking about ways to get this right. And support the better development of the nature-based carbon market, while also recognizing that natural climate solutions are not just acting in terms of climate mitigation, but also climate adaptation and other co-benefits associated with these projects for biodiversity, water, and numerous other ecosystem services. So we need to really be thinking about ways to monitor forests, not just for how much they grow, but for how much they reduce vulnerability and support diverse ecosystem services, and push towards new adaptation-relevant metrics. So part of my work has been with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, thinking through some of these adaptation-based approaches, or forest-based adaptation approaches, as well as who depends on those forest ecosystems for their livelihoods. And this started with work in 2021 and 2022, looking at the number of forest and tree proximate people globally. Unexpectedly, the majority of the world's rural population lives within about 1 kilometer of forests. And we know from extensive literature that forests and trees play key roles in the lives and livelihoods of people around the world. So we need to be really careful in terms of blindly implementing carbon projects when there are numerous people who are depending on these forests. And we need to do it in a way that is incorporating their goals and livelihoods into that calculus. And this more recent work that we're doing in partnership with the FAO is thinking about how forests and natural climate solutions can better be integrated into the global goal on adaptation under Article 7 of the Paris Agreement. And this kind of mapping exercise kind of helps reveal how forests are prioritized differently when we think about them in terms of strictly carbon and biodiversity value. So as expected, a lot of the world's really densely forested regions, dense moist tropical forests pop out as really critical in terms of carbon and biodiversity. But when we kind of take that conservation value for carbon and biodiversity and water quality against like the vulnerability of people to climate change, so concerns over drought, flooding, extreme heat, and the roles that trees and forests can help in terms of adapting to those extreme climate events, especially for the world's forest populations. A lot of the kind of priority areas shift, And we can really think about forest in terms of more than just mitigation, but also adaptation and the co-benefits of those trees. So to conclude, ultimately what we're doing is arguing for an open and inclusive science approach to using remote sensing for forest policy, advocating for more open, free, accessible data, integration of, again, open and free cloud computing tools like Google Earth Engine to lower technical barriers, incorporating community-centered monitoring, thinking about ways that these tools can help alleviate reporting burdens while also providing tools that can help communities monitor their own forest systems and lead their own solutions and advocate for their rights. And promoting this interdisciplinary, kind of modal communication to develop effective DMRV tools. And what I'd like you to take away is our best practice guidance for DMRV implementation, focus on standardizing data inputs, validating with independent ground truth data to minimize systematic model bias, establish consistent uncertainty metrics, test and follow new protocols to require DMRV providers to report comprehensive location-specific uncertainty metrics, and use those confidence intervals within the crediting schemes. Prioritize community-centered monitoring where Indigenous people and local communities are part of the co-design process and can help validate the tools and ensure legitimacy and local buy-in. Move to more open and transparent science, and embrace an integrated approach, combining DMRV with periodic targeted on-site audit spot checks to verify the integrity of those DMRV tools. So thank you for going on through this whirlwind introduction to DMRV. As I said, this is very much work in progress that we're thinking through actively. And I appreciate any questions, thoughts, and ideas for moving this forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any questions for Sarah?
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering, would conventional topographic maps prove an economical way of inventorying the forest and perhaps monitoring the changes in forest coverage through use of different editions of maps of the same area? Or is that information just too generalized to be useful?
Yeah, so the question is essentially, can we use land cover maps that tell us where forests are to
Right.
monitor how they're changing over time within the carbon market? Is that
More or
correct?
less, yeah, but I mean, using topographic maps as an economic alternative to satellite imagery or other fancy devices.
Yeah, so I think the challenge is really ensuring that there's additionality in the carbon projects. So if, I mean, we need to be able to look at kind of changes over time, how specific carbon stocks are changing over time, especially if they're being used to offset other sources of emissions.
Right.
And so the kind of need for using remote sensing is to get kind of structural indicators of the forest quality in order to kind of have biomass specific carbon estimates.
Right.
So I'm not sure.
I just thought that they might be a more economic alternative possibly. And, I mean, for most of Latin America, you can probably obtain mapping at the scale of 1 to 50,000 for much, if not all of the continent. So I just thought that might be an economic alternative to using more high-tech technology and more expensive instrumentation or whatever.
Right. Thanks.
Cool.
Yeah, really interesting talk. I kind of thought for a while, and probably a lot of people have come up with the same idea, but like, it seems like the carbon market incentivizes like over extraction because then you can apply to be one of the projects that averts extraction, right?
Yeah.
Like, is there a way to like monitor for those kinds of like broader scale kind of like consequences? Like, it seems like it doesn't fit squarely into like the for a baseline in the surrounding area because of the presence of the carbon market providing credits in this place induces lots more like exploitation that just shows up in a different that shows up in the baseline. Right? So,
Yeah. That's a really important question is, are there kind of anticipation effects associated with the presence or expected incoming of carbon markets? And this is something that there are a number of researchers who are looking at. So the way that most of the carbon protocols work is that you're taking like a multi-year average of the baseline, and that's supposed to help account for any anticipatory effects. But it's of course pretty imperfect. There are I'm thinking of a specific article in the jurisdictional red context that was looking at exactly that question. Like, are there anticipatory effects associated with jurisdictional red? So they were looking at if there was spikes in deforestation just before the carbon market entered the landscape, and found that there were surprisingly few anticipatory effects. They did find that that there was pretty high initial, like, first year overcrediting, but after that first year, there was a much higher accuracy of the crediting. So I think there are, like, that is a concern, whether people are anticipating the arrival of the carbon market deforesting a bunch so that they're more eligible to participate in the carbon market. And there are, like, bad actors, people who are taking advantage of the system. And that's something that we've kind of talked about within our working group is, if we're creating these digital products, are we essentially setting the scene for more people to have that kind of anticipatory effect and say, okay, here's where we see like an unusually large opportunity for a carbon project. We're going to specifically design around this, even though maybe the risks to that area are low, or potential for like elite capture of the benefits from the carbon projects by seeing kind of this like having a wall-to-wall coverage of forest carbon potentially opens the opportunity for bad actors to strategically develop carbon projects that are essentially fall into that category of delivering more credits than they should be.
Yeah. I guess some of us kind of have this funny feeling that it's like, if you threaten to cut down all the world's forests and then say, like, I'll not do it if you give me a bunch of credits, and there's no additionality, but it looks like that from like a
Yeah.
But it sounds like, at least currently, it's not like a empirically relevant kind of like concern.
At least not from that jurisdictional red study. I'm sure you could find examples of projects that had kind of more like that anticipatory effect. But that doesn't seem to be the biggest problem within the carbon market, even though, yeah, there's a lot of problems. I'm the first to admit that. Doing work in this space, it feels like we need to find better approaches to support a more effective carbon market, even if it's probably going to remain imperfect for a long time.
So thanks for the talk. I got a couple questions, maybe a shorter one first. You were talking about these black box commercialized products, right?
Yeah.
Would there be any utility in having a group like Shift or somebody else be able to put like a stamp of approval on these? Would that carry any weight? So if you could verify some aspects of it, and then they could put on the website. I'm thinking very simplistically, but look, we've got their stamp of approval. You know, are there thoughts along these lines at all?
Yes. Yeah. So part of the current system is verification bodies looking at are these estimates valid for carbon. So the initial question is, are the VDBs the group to take on that responsibility? And I think not. I think especially if we're looking at global products, that's a pretty big ask. So Shift CM has officially partnered with ICVCM, which is the, oh goodness, I'm so bad with acronyms, International Council Integrity.
It's okay.
Yeah, ICVCM is basically the international body that's reviewing existing and new protocols and saying, here's how they're kind of meeting our standards for what good carbon crediting protocols look like. Are they doing their due diligence? And it feels like maybe ICVCM should play that role, maybe more academic oriented bodies need to play that role. But I think there is certainly opportunity to provide some verification in that way. So whether that's the role of academia, interdisciplinary collaborations, or international bodies, I think that's still kind of part of a negotiation process.
I want to ask you about some of the uncertainty quantification. So you listed 4 aspects there, right? So I guess maybe 2 questions related to that. One is, do one of those kind of dominate in terms of the uncertainty? So you've got 4, or there probably more. Do 1 or 2 of those dominate the uncertainty? Do they have a lot and the others are minor? And then is the uncertainty across those so much that when you're looking at candidate versus baseline, they tend to get washed out a little bit because the uncertainty is so large? Or can you really dial it in enough that you can see statistically significant? I don't know if that's clear.
Those are great questions.
Okay.
Yeah, and I don't have complete answers for you now because that's exactly what we're looking at.
Okay.
Is which are the kind of key drivers of uncertainty, and also thinking about kind of the geographical relevance of these products. So, what can we detect and where? Like, where are those confidence intervals just like always going to overlap because they're so wide? And we're really expecting to see that, especially in drier forest regions. So, can we use these tools for those applications? Can we use these tools for improved forest management applications? Like, what's the timeline where we're actually be able to get good biomass estimates across these different types of activities? And so that's what we're collecting as much global data as possible to test these different like uncertainty protocols against and answer exactly these questions. So I'll say
it's a hard problem.
Yeah,
For sure.
it is.
Okay. So I'll get back to it.
Yes.
Great. All right, well, we're about time, so we should stop there. So thank you very much, really appreciate it, Sarah. It was a nice talk.
Thank you.
I know we had people online also, so